Tonight, I want you to carry my child. Jonas's rough voice broke the hush of the steam-filled washroom, and Elena's heart clenched. His back, broad, bronzed, dripping, lay beneath her trembling hand as she held the damp cloth. Jonas, once indifferent to the marriage forced upon him, now leaned forward, letting Elena press the warm cloth over his sun-darkened shoulders. She, the woman who had sworn to keep her distance until the 2-year contract expired, found herself shaking in this first act of closeness. Mist coiled around them, water drops pattering against the wooden floor like the pounding of their unguarded hearts. A marriage once bound by the promise of parting, now pulled tight with an ache neither could deny. And in that thick veil of steam, Elena was left to ask herself, was this only a moment of weakness, or the night a new fate began? In 1885, the frontier had its own way of making folks sign papers their hearts had never laid eyes on. And by that way, Jonas Whitfield and Elena Marquez were pushed to the altar, beneath the sweltering August sun of Red Willow. The wooden church stood in the center of town, its whitewashed walls already flaking in patches. The rafters groaned with every draft, and the wildflowers stuck in glass jars on the altar had wilted, their petals drooping as if weary of the wedding itself. Cicadas rasped outside, refusing to blend with the hymn, thickening the air with heat and unease. Jonas Whitfield stood beside his bride in a white shirt that was clean but wrinkled, carrying little trace of solemnity. His collar hung open at the throat, and his hat brim dipped low, hiding eyes that drifted elsewhere, half-hearted through the motions. Folks called him the most pampered son a mother ever raised, never short of pressed clothes, never once made his own bed. And now, on his own wedding day, he looked less like a man taking a vow than a boy forced to stand where he did not wish to be. Elena Marquez was cut from harder cloth. The brown-skinned girl stood tall, chin lifted, her face weathered by years under the stern command of her father. The gloves at her wrists bound her like shackles to this marriage. Every line of her face held steady, not from fear, but from the drilled restraint of her upbringing. A lady must never show her heart. Her father, Mateo Marquez, had repeated it often enough. Feelings are weakness, and weakness cannot keep a fortune. The preacher opened his book, voice droning like a wagon wheel rolling down a dusty road. Vows filled the church, but to the young pair they were no more than recited lessons. Jonas repeated them without stumble, Elena without tremor, their words passing cold and empty, as though two prisoners exchanged chains instead of rings. When it came time to kiss the bride, Jonas bent and brushed her lips, barely a touch, as quick and distant as if from a flame. She neither resisted nor returned it. The moment was so brief that anyone who blinked might swear it never happened. From the pews, Red Willow's people nodded, trading glances. Mrs. Peterson from the boarding house whispered that Elena looked handsome in a cold way, while Bill Henderson chuckled, clapping Jonas on the back, trying to laugh off the stiffness. Blessings were spoken, but pity glimmered behind every smile. All knew this was no love story. It was a contract signed with a handshake and a drink between two fathers. Their children played as pawns. After 37 minutes that felt like 37 hours, the sun slanted through dusty panes. The bouquet in Elena's hand sagged, petals heavy with a sour scent, mirroring her heart pressed into mold. Jonas tugged at his collar, sighed, and cast his eyes through the window as though searching for an escape. When they stepped out through the church doors, the bell tolled across the town, yet it sounded not of joy, but like a knell, tolling the death of their freedom. The townsfolk gathered close, tossing hollow wishes, shaking hands, smiling thinly, none believing love would ever grow here. A child, hiding at the porch rail, tugged at his mother's dress and asked, "Do they love each other?" The woman pulled him close, shook her head, then forced a smile. "Of course they do, darling." That false smile was the very mask worn by the whole community, a coat of paint over a truth too plain to miss. Elena lifted her face to the blazing sun, shadows stretching long across the dirt street. To these people she was no longer the girl who dreamed of leaving, who longed to choose her own road. She was now nothing but the Whitfield bride, a piece traded in a bargain. Jonas held out his hand, a gesture required of him. Elena placed her gloved hand in his, her fingers slack. Side by side they descended the church steps, resembling condemned souls more than man and wife. Scattered applause followed, a few hats raised in habit. A hot gust blew through, flinging red dust onto the hem of her gown. Dust, heat, and pretense. There was not a breath of true joy in all that the town had witnessed. And in that very moment, Red Willow whispered behind them, "This marriage is no love. It is a prison closed tight. Two strangers have just been sentenced to share a roof for years to come." Jonas Whitfield had never known the sound of a rooster cutting through dawn, or the sting of prairie wind against bare skin. For 23 years, every morning of his life began with his mother, Clara Whitfield, knocking softly at his door, stepping in with a wooden tray, a glass of warm milk, bread spread with butter, sometimes a handful of strawberries picked from the bush out back. She would straighten his blanket, hum a hymn, and leave him to linger in bed until the sun had already gilded the valley. His father was cut of harder timber, a true rancher, rising before first light, wearing his back down to a curve, hands hard with callus. Yet strangely, he never put his only son to the plow, never told him to shovel earth or lead a horse to field. To him, it was enough that Jonas grow tall, marry a proper wife, and carry the Whitfield name forward. In their wide wooden house on the edge of Red Willow, labor belonged to others. Jonas could toss a dust-caked coat in a corner, and by morning it was washed and smelling of soap. He could leave muddy boots on the porch, and they would vanish, returning polished. Such habits raised him with an ease he never questioned. The world turned to serve him, not the other way around. So Jonas bore the look of a frontier man, broad-shouldered, strong-armed, eyes blue as creek water after rain. Yet his spirit walked a road already cleared of stones. He could ride, could shoot, but seldom had cause. He could smile, could charm, but rarely cared to shoulder the weight of duty. Elena Marquez's life was forged in a mold of the opposite sort. Her father, Mateo Marquez, allowed no softness under his roof. He was the richest merchant across 3 counties, shrewd as a hawk, wealthy and cold. To him, all things bore a price, even affection. His eldest daughter was to be a polished piece of trade, and from the age of 6 she was shaped as such. At 5 each morning, his cane knocked at her door. Elena had to be dressed, hair smoothed, seated at her desk. Mornings filled with numbers, reading, ledger work. Midday with manners, posture, how to hold a smile just so. Afternoons spent in the store, writing notes, counting stock, watching customers. And at nightfall, Mateo drilled into her the discipline of swallowing tears. Emotion, he said, was a luxury no merchant's daughter could afford. Once, at 9 years old, she cried after being scolded unfairly by a customer. Mateo gave no comfort, no scolding either. He opened the door to a dark closet, locked her inside, and told her, "When you can cry without sound, when your face is dry, then you may step out." From that day forward, Elena learned silence, learned how to trap sobs in her throat. Even her smile was measured. Too broad, her father called it vulgar. Too faint, he called it cold. At last she chose not to smile at all, keeping her face steady. By then her eyes had learned the habit, carrying a mist no one could read, whether sorrow or hope lay behind it. She grew up in a house polished to gleam, every chair in place, every cup aligned, yet that order pressed down on her like a weight. She never knew a mother's hand through her hair at dawn, never heard gentle praise, never tasted rebellion like other girls her age. She only knew to obey, to perform, and to prepare for the day her father would trade her like stock in a deal. And so it was that Jonas, a boy raised in softness, and Elena, a girl caged by iron discipline, were thrust into marriage. They could not understand each other, could hardly try. He was used to indulgence, she to command. He turned idle at hardship, she turned rigid. Their fathers shook hands, believing they had bound two strong houses, but what they truly bound were two lives standing in stark opposition, and they set them inside one small home in Red Willow, where love had no natural soil. The town whispered of it. Whitfield's boy never lifted a finger. Marquez's girl, she's cold steel. How could they live together? And the whispers were right. From the very first day, Jonas and Elena knew the distance between them was more than separate rooms. It lay in the roots that raised them. One man's hand was soft, untouched by toil. One woman's hand was calloused from pen and ledger, forced to perfect lines until they bled. One childhood was sung awake by hymns. The other learned to smother laughter before it was born. Jonas Whitfield and Elena Marquez, bound by the signatures of their fathers, carried in them two roots that would never twist together. And it was in those roots, in their stark divide, that all their days ahead would find their fate. The small wooden house Jonas's father had built for the young couple stood lonesome on the edge of Red Willow, where the dirt road spilled into wide pasture. It wasn't grand, nor poor, but it was solid. The new pine walls still carried their resin scent, the brown shingles were neatly set, and a narrow porch stretched forward like an open hand, bidding someone come home. But to Elena, it was no home at all. It was a station where she would serve her sentence, 2 years bound like a prisoner. She stepped inside, hand gripping the worn leather handle of her valise, then let it drop onto the boards with a sharp thud. The sound marked a line between her and the man standing awkward behind her. Her eyes swept the place. 2 bedrooms, a small kitchen, a front room scattered with chairs that matched nothing, all arranged by Jonas's father to call this a family house. It was tidy, sufficient, but it carried nothing of her breath. She asked no opinion, gave no explanation. Her words came quiet, but steady. "I'll take the small room." Jonas followed her glance toward the door she had chosen. He didn't argue. He only sighed, shrugged lightly, and said, "Fine." I don't need much space, so it was decided. No discussion, no bargain between husband and wife. Only 2 strangers dividing ground in a house his father had hammered together. Their first meal, Elena cooked a plain stew, set it on the fresh-cut table still marked with saw lines. Jonas sat, served himself. She did the same. They ate with heads bowed, silence broken only by spoons on bowls and steam fogging the window. Even the wind at the porch boards spoke louder than they did. Jonas had known the noisy meals of his own home, his mother asking, his father telling stories, sisters laughing. Here in this narrow kitchen, he felt his own breath echo back at him. He lifted his eyes, meaning to speak, but Elena sat straight, gaze fixed downward, her face hard as carved stone. He dropped his head again, eating on, as though no words had stirred at all. Night fell under the dim wash of a kerosene lamp. Elena shut herself behind the small room's door, Jonas in the larger. One wall of pine lay between them, but they might as well have lived in separate worlds. Both lay listening to wind slip through seams, to insects whisper in the dark. Elena turned on her side, staring into black rafters, her chest full of strangeness. Jonas sighed, pulled the blanket over his head, and told himself, 2 years. Only 2 years. Days began to roll, each like the one before. Elena rose early, set out breakfast, left his portion waiting, then withdrew into her room like a housemaid doing her duty. Jonas woke later, ate alone, went to the ranch fields. At night, he returned weary to find supper left neatly, Elena already gone behind her door. They crossed in hallway, in kitchen, at the threshold. Each meeting passed as quiet as two boarders sharing space. Jonas had learned to smile politely at young strangers, but with Elena he pressed his lips tight. There was no reason to smile. Elena, for her part, offered only a nod, her eyes veiled, never betraying a spark of feeling. One night, with wind rattling at the windows, Elena sat at the small table, notebook open, pen scratching faint lines like she was mapping time itself. Jonas stepped into the front room and saw her face caught in the lamplight, skin browned by sun, eyes heavy with shadow. He stood uncertain, then let out the question. "Do you mean to live this way forever?" Elena raised her gaze straight into his. Her voice was cold as night frost. "Not forever. 2 years. Then we're free." Jonas froze. The thought had lived in him often enough, but hearing it in her voice, the words hit with the weight of stone. 2 years. That number hung in the rafters, a rope binding them even as it promised release. He nodded, like a man signing a sentence without reading it. 2 years. Then he turned back to his room, leaving Elena with pen still wet upon the page. Outside, Red Willow lay hushed. Stars pricked the endless sky above the prairie, watching two newlyweds living as strangers under one roof. Folks always said marriage was the place where love begins. But in this wooden house, it was only a contract ticking down. 2 years. To most, it was not long. To them, it stretched like a lifetime. And in the silence of that house, both Jonas and Elena lay awake wondering, would those years crawl by as punishment? Or would they one day find a turn neither dared yet to imagine? The first month in the wooden house at Red Willow's edge passed like exile. Each day mirrored the last, so dull that if Elena hadn't marked the kitchen doorframe with chalk lines, she wouldn't have known how many mornings had slipped by. She rose early, as habit drilled into her since childhood, stoking the fire, scrubbing corners, laying out breakfast neat upon the table. Then she withdrew into her small room, leaving the hours to drift in silence. Jonas lived otherwise. He often left before the sun was fully risen, out to the ranch with the hands. He hauled saddles, led horses, even hammered rails back into place. He worked himself ragged, not from devotion, but for the excuse to avoid the heavy air of that house. At night, he ate the meal she had set aside, without praise, without complaint. When finished, he poured a glass of water, went to his room, and thus the day was done. Between them only brief, barren words were spoken. Fetch more water. Do we have enough wood? Tomorrow, the market. Each sounded like a cold knock against stone, stripped of feeling or kinship. Jonas soon grew restless with Elena's orderliness. She folded everything sharp and exact, from the tablecloth down to bits of ribbon. If he left his boots astray, she snatched them up, sometimes with a sigh sharp enough to sting. Everything must have its place, she had once said, and those words needled him more than any scolding. He'd been raised to have others clear his mess without a murmur. Her precision felt like judgment. Elena, in turn, bore her own torment, his snoring. It wasn't a steady, soothing rumble, but a thunderous roar, shaking the thin walls, rattling the window frames. Each night she lay twisting, her blanket wound tight, eyes wide in the dark. Once she tried stuffing cotton in her ears, but the sound stormed straight through. One night, after nearly an hour of sleepless rage, Elena rose, no longer caring for rules or restraint. She draped a shawl over her shoulders and crossed into the larger room. Moonlight spilled across Jonas's form, stretched on his side, chest rising with heavy breath. She stepped close, laid her hand lightly on his shoulder, meaning to shake him, turn him over, grant herself rest. But the moment she touched him, his warm hand clamped around her wrist. His eyes opened, blurred with sleep. In an instant, he pulled her down, holding her against his chest. Elena's breath caught, her ear filled with the pounding of his heart. The scent of sweat, of pine, the heat of him pressed all around. Their faces hung inches apart. Jonas's blue eyes, clouded with drowsiness, blinked into hers. His voice rasped low, tinged with dream. "Did you mean to sleep with me?" Elena flushed hot, her body locked stiff, her wrist still trapped. For a breath she felt her pulse racing wild. Her lips pressed shut against the words that wanted out but would not come. At last she wrenched free, rose sharply, her back to him. Her voice came strained but cold. "Don't speak foolishness." She strode out, never looking back. Jonas shifted, half awake still, his gaze lost in the shadows. He could not tell if it had been dream or waking, but for a fleeting moment he had felt the trace of her hair's fragrance, her breath trembling, the quick beat she could not hide. Elena shut her own door behind her and sank onto the bed. Her heart pounded as though it would split her chest. She told herself it was an accident, a mistake. Yet beneath the blanket pulled over her face, she knew sleep would not come again. That night, the wooden house on Red Willow's edge was as quiet as ever. But for the first time, Elena heard her own heartbeat louder than her husband's thunder. In that little wooden house, the days no longer carried the heavy stillness of before. Within the long stretches of silence, tiny fractures began to show, slivers of light slipping through the walls. They were not grand gestures, only small details. Yet those details kept the two from seeing each other as complete strangers. Jonas noticed it first. One afternoon, leading his horse back across the yard, he stopped short. Elena was crouched on the porch, her brown hair tied in haste, loose strands falling across her sun-darkened cheek. Before her lay a stray dog, ribs sharp beneath mangy fur, tongue lolling as it panted weakly. Elena held out a scrap of bread saved from noon, her hand trembling, her voice soft as running water. "Go on. Don't be afraid." "I won't hurt you." Jonas stood frozen, forgetting the reins in his hand. The woman he had known since their wedding, rigid, straight, cold as iron, suddenly turned into someone else. Warm, gentle, truly a woman, not a gray shadow haunting the house. He turned away before she saw him, but her voice lingered in his chest long after. Elena, too, began to notice things in her husband. Though careless by nature, Jonas never slammed a door. When passing through the sitting room, if he saw her book left open, he never shoved it aside. He always slipped a scrap of paper between the pages to mark her place. He never spoke of it, never sought credit. But he did it often enough that Elena found herself thinking, perhaps he isn't as thoughtless as I believed. So she began placing a basin of warm water outside the washroom each morning. She never mentioned it, never explained. But Jonas, finding the steam still rising, understood. Each time he splashed his face, he felt some unseen cord stretch from her hand to his. One winter morning, fog lay thick over the fields. Elena stepped into the yard carrying a wooden plate. The smell of fried eggs and hot cornbread rose into the cold mist, giving the scene a kind of life. Jonas had stripped off his coat and was splitting logs, the thud of the axe steady as a hymn. She stopped, hesitated, then walked closer. "Eat something," she said, her voice still even, yet tinged with shyness. Jonas turned, his blue eyes startled. He looked at the steaming food, then at her face glowing faint pink under the haze. Beads of sweat ran from her neck down to her collarbone. In that instant, she was no longer a contract wife in his eyes, but a woman alive and striking. He reached for the plate, but his gaze stayed on her. Without knowing why, he stepped closer, just one breath apart, his face nearly touching hers. Elena trembled. His warm breath brushed her cheek, leaving her lightheaded. Her eyes drifted shut, lips parted, as though instinct welcomed what reason had not prepared for. But Jonas only raised his hand, brushing a strand of her hair back, gentle as if soothing a child. "What are you thinking?" he murmured, smiling faintly. "I just meant to wipe the sweat from your brow." Elena's eyes flew open, her face burning. She swatted at his chest, not enough to hurt, just to hide her fluster. "You... really?" She turned before finishing, skirts flaring through the fog, fleeing back into the house. Jonas stood where she left him, the plate of eggs still warm in his hand, but his heart pounding harder than his axe had struck. He knew the line they had drawn on their wedding day had cracked. Just a small crack, but wide enough for light to find its way through. And that morning, with the fields veiled in mist, he could not keep the smile from breaking at his lips. Winter nights in Red Willow were so cold that even the wind seemed reluctant to slip through the cracks. Snow lay heavy across the yard, the moon hidden behind thick clouds, leaving the wooden house sunk in dark silence, broken only by the snap and hiss of the stove fire. Elena curled beneath her blanket, eyes accustomed to the dark, waiting for the sound she had come to despise night after night, the thunder of Jonas's snoring from the room next door. But this night, strangely, there was nothing. No snoring, no restless shifting. Only a silence so absolute it jolted her wide awake. Elena's heart pounded. She strained her ears, desperate for the heavy breath, the familiar rasp, but there was none. The hush grew so thick it felt as if life itself had been drawn from the house. Fear rose, tight in her chest. She pushed aside the covers, bare feet meeting the icy floor. Every step down the wooden hall groaned under her weight, betraying the panic she tried to swallow. She stopped at Jonas's door, her hand trembling on the latch. "What am I doing?" A decent wife doesn't barge into her husband's room in the dead of night. Her father's voice echoed sharp in her head. But then an image crashed in. Jonas lying still, breath gone. The nightmare outweighed the rule. She turned the handle. Darkness spilled out, thick and heavy. On the bed, Jonas lay motionless, face pale beneath a strip of moonlight that slipped through the curtain. Too still, too quiet. "Jonas!" she gasped, rushing to him, her voice breaking in her throat. She shook his shoulder, then his whole body, frantic, tears spilling down her face. Her hair tumbled loose, the blanket slid from her shoulders, her thin nightdress clinging damp with cold sweat. Her voice cracked into sobs. I thought you were dead. Don't leave me alone." Jonas startled awake, pulled from deep sleep by the desperate weight clinging to him. In the dim light, he saw her face, shaking, tear-streaked, dark eyes wide with terror like a trapped fawn. For the first time he saw her stripped bare of armor, no cold restraint, no rigid poise. Only Elena, raw, vulnerable, unable to hold herself together. He sat up, arms circling her, hand patting her back as though soothing a child. "Easy. I was only sleeping deep. I'm here, but—" She didn't let go. She pressed her face against his chest, sobbing, repeating again and again, "I thought you were gone. I thought—" The wall of silence that had stood between them for months crumbled in an instant. Jonas held her tighter, breathing in the scent of her hair, sharp with sweat, tinged with the cheap soap she used. And for reasons he couldn't name, his own heart pounded hard. He bent his head, voice low, steady. "Tonight, stay here with me. Just to hold." Nothing more. Elena stiffened, lifting her tear-swollen eyes to his. In her terror, his words sounded not like jest, but like shelter. She hesitated, lips moving, but no refusal came. Jonas shifted, making space on the bed. Elena slid down slowly, turning her back, her heart still hammering. He drew his arm around her waist, pulling her gently close. The warmth of his body wrapped over her, his breath steady against her neck. In the dark, their hearts beat against each other, uneven, restless. Elena shut her eyes tight, willing sleep to come, yet every nerve stayed alert. She felt his hand rest lightly at her waist, not grasping, not claiming, only as if to be sure she remained there. Jonas did not sleep either. Every small twitch of her body, every quiver in her breath, ran through him like sparks. But he kept his word. Only held her. Only made certain that, for this one night, neither of them was alone. Outside, the wind wailed across the snowy fields. Inside, for the first time since their wedding, their breaths mingled in the same space. No wall, no separate rooms. Only two souls, strange to each other yet suddenly close, trembling together in the same embrace, knowing well that on this night, neither would find rest. That morning, the The sky over Red Willow hung heavy and gray, the wind whipping down from the northern hills. Snowmelt left patches of mud along the dirt road leading into town. From a distance, Elena saw a black carriage roll slowly into the yard, its wheels sinking deep into the slush. Her heart seized the instant she recognized the straight-backed figure inside. The thick, dark cloak, the eyes sharp as blades. None other than Mateo Marquez, her father. He stepped down with the practiced air of a man accustomed to command. His polished boots touched ground without a speck of mud, for a servant quickly shielded him. His gaze swept over the modest wooden house, the porch sagging slightly in the wind, the windows fogged with frost. In that look there was only disappointment, no trace of tenderness. Jonas stood in the yard, sawdust still clinging to his hands from chopping wood. He wiped them on his trousers and stepped forward, meaning to offer a hand. But Mateo ignored it, only cutting him with a cold stare before pushing through the door. At the sitting room table, Mateo spread a stack of papers, each sheet neat as a contract. A train ticket lay on top, beside an envelope listing wealthy candidates from San Francisco he had prepared. I hear the two of you live like lodgers under the same roof. No children, no bond. This must end. Elena stood frozen, fingers clenched in her dress. Jonas was silent, his father-in-law's words cutting straight into what he had always known but never spoken. Yes, this marriage had begun as a sentence, and part of him thought, if her father had arranged everything, perhaps it was easier to let go. Jonas bowed his head, chin sinking to his chest, as though ready to accept whatever was dictated. His silence sent a chill through Elena. She saw it plain. If she didn't speak now, her life would again be seized and steered like her childhood had been. And then, in that suffocating moment, words burst from her lips, unplanned, trembling, yet firm. I'm with child. The room froze. Jonas jerked upright, eyes wide on his wife. Mateo stopped cold, the hand folding papers arrested mid-air. For the first time in years, Elena saw her father unsettled, his steel gaze wavering. What? He rasped, voice breaking. What did you say? Elena drew a deep breath, lifted her face though her heart pounded. I am going to have a child. Your grandchild. For several breaths, the man who had ruled 3 counties stood mute, his careful schemes crumbling to dust. The train ticket on the table was worthless now. The fine matches in San Francisco meant nothing. He looked at his daughter, sun-browned cheeks, spine straight, eyes no longer downcast. You are certain? His voice had lost its edge, softer, questioning. Elena nodded. I am. The room fell silent. Outside, wind whistled through the cracks, but inside, only 3 hearts beat out of rhythm. Jonas still sat stunned, barely grasping what he'd heard, yet a small fire sparked in his chest. Mateo exhaled slowly, his words no longer sliced like knives, but carried weight and weariness. In that case, it is different. A child cannot be cast aside. It was a turning point. The man who had never bent before anyone was stopped cold by a truth too heavy to dismiss. The shadow of his power, which had pressed over Elena all her life, retreated a step. For those who might have witnessed, it would have been a satisfying sight. The stern father who treated his daughter as a pawn, now forced to soften by the promise of new life. And Elena, the woman thought powerless, changed the course with one simple, unyielding sentence. The room seemed to widen. The divorce papers lay abandoned on the table, unspoken. Jonas straightened in his chair, casting his wife a look that carried not just surprise but respect. Elena set her hand lightly over her still flat belly, and for the first time in her life, she saw her father silent, not in control, but because control had slipped from him. That night, the wooden house on the edge of Red Willow was quieter than ever. After the confrontation that afternoon, the divorce papers lay abandoned on the table, stripped of meaning. Her father had gone, leaving behind an air that was heavy, yet strangely unburdened. Jonas sat still at the table, watching the fire crackle in the hearth, while Elena stood at the window, her hand resting faintly over the flat of her belly. They both knew. The words she had spoken before her father, "I am with child," were only a shield. A desperate ruse, a sudden strike that had forced Mateo Marquez to retreat. Behind them was nothing, no proof, no truth, only emptiness, and two pairs of eyes meeting, each knowing exactly what the other had seen. Jonas broke the silence first. His voice was low, almost a whisper, but it filled the room where only the fire had spoken. "You know it, don't you?" "We both know," Elena turned, her eyes shadowed, yet she did not deny it. The truth lay naked between them, needing no name. She pressed her lips tight, bracing for reproach, for anger she thought she deserved. But Jonas did not deliver either. He rose and crossed the space, stopping just a step away. The blue of his eyes caught the firelight, no longer indifferent. "If you told him that—" He paused, exhaled sharply. "Then let's make it true." Elena froze. The words struck mad, yet they carried a calm certainty. Half of her wanted to scoff, to cast them aside, but the other half, the part where her heart pounded hard, trembled because she had thought of it too, though never dared admit it. "Jonas," she breathed, her voice breaking. He did not wait for her refusal. His hand touched her shoulder, hot, heavy, like a vow pressed into her skin. Elena quivered, but did not pull away. She lifted her face, her gaze met his, and the space between them vanished. Their first true kiss came sudden, no longer clumsy, no longer a brush of lips like at the altar. It burned, fierce and urgent, unleashing the long months of silence, restless nights, and skipped heartbeats. Elena's head spun. The smell of smoke, of sweat, of living flesh swirled around her, tearing her free from the rules that had bound her all her life. For the first time she heard no scolding voice in her head, no lessons in etiquette, no thought of what was proper. Only herself and Jonas. They stumbled, clumsy, like two who had never learned how to give themselves. Laughter tangled with ragged breaths, with half-formed whispers. And it was the awkwardness that made it real, unfeigned, close. Jonas held her, as though he feared she might vanish. Elena clung to him, as though she had at last found shelter. The fire flared, casting its glow across their entwined bodies, shadows trembling along the wooden walls. That night, they crossed not only the barrier of flesh, they shattered the wall that had stood unseen between them these 2 years. In mingled breath and fierce embrace, they knew that the lie of the afternoon had become the seed of truth. When at last Elena lay against Jonas's chest, her breathing still ragged, her heart still wild, she whispered with eyes shut tight, "Perhaps now it really is true." Jonas smiled softly, kissing her hair. "Yes, true, and I do not regret it." Outside, the prairie wind wailed as though to wipe all trace away. But within the wooden house, two who had once been strangers had found a closeness no force could deny. That first night, awkward, blazing, born of both falsehood and honesty, stood as a mark, turning a marriage arranged into a story entirely new. The morning after that night, sunlight streamed through the small window, touching a room still scented with wood smoke and the warmth of two bodies. Elena stirred, turning slightly, her hand brushing against Jonas's solid chest. She started, meaning to draw back, but Jonas caught her hand, smiling through sleep. No words passed at first, yet the silence no longer pressed heavy. It felt instead like the calm after a storm, when both are spent but unburdened. "Good morning," Jonas murmured, his voice rough but gentle. Elena nodded, her cheeks flushed. She did not answer aloud, but left her hand within his. For her, it was answer enough. The days that followed saw the wooden house take on a different shape. Elena no longer turned aside when Jonas entered a room. Jonas no longer found excuses to leave late for the ranch to avoid breakfast. They sat at the same table, sometimes trading awkward jests, enough to turn silence into a quiet tune of ease. One weekend afternoon, Jonas suggested they ride down to town together. Elena hesitated. Since their wedding, they had never once walked side by side in Red Willow. But this time she did not wish to hide. She pulled on a simple blue dress, tied her hair neat, and waited on the porch. When Jonas stepped out, hat in hand, his eyes lit at the sight of her. "Ready?" he asked. Elena gave a small nod. And then, as natural as breath, Jonas held out his hand. She glanced at the rough palm, then placed hers in it. Warmth spread through her, steadying her steps. Together, they walked the red dirt road leading to the heart of Red Willow. Rumor traveled faster than wind. As they passed, every gaze turned. The seamstress stepped into her doorway. Children dropped their marbles. Cowboys in the saloon fell silent mid-laugh. Surprise rippled through the town. Whitfield and the Marquez girl, holding hands. "Well, I'll be—" Whispers followed them. Where once their wedding had stirred pity, now their walk together drew astonishment. Elena lowered her head, face hot, but her hand held Jonas's firmly, and Jonas walked straight, shoulders proud, as if daring the town to see what had changed. At the general store, while buying salt and nails, the shopkeeper grinned and nodded. "You two look well matched." Elena glanced at Jonas. He looked back at her, and then, without planning it, both laughed. Light, yet carrying the weight of a beginning. That evening, back home, they sat on the porch watching the sun sink red behind the hills. Jonas laid his hand over Elena's, his voice low but sure. "Elena, maybe it's time we stop living like strangers. If we've begun, then let's truly build a home." Elena looked out across the prairie, the wind tugging her skirt, carrying the smell of fresh grass. A strange tide rose in her, fear mingled with longing. Then she nodded, eyes clear. "Then let's promise. Not just endure 2 years, but build a true home together." In that moment, a new vow was born, not one written by fathers, not a contract inked by hand, but by their own choosing. And for the first time, the bond between them was no longer a chain, but a choice. That night, Red Willow lay unusually still. The evening wind had quieted, leaving only the crackle of the stove fire, its glow painting gold across the worn timbers of the house. Elena cleared the supper dishes, wiped the table clean, then, as she had for months, prepared a basin of warm water for Jonas. Steam curled upward, carrying the plain scent of soap. Jonas sat on the long bench, shrugging off his heavy coat, his shirt collar open, his face damp with sweat from a day's labor on the ranch. When Elena carried the basin over, he looked up, the firelight catching in his eyes. "You know," he said, his voice even, touched with mischief, "I've had a habit since I was a boy." Elena set down the basin, turned to him with a faint frown. "What habit?" Jonas leaned back, lips tugging in a half-smile, as though about to speak something improper. "I've always liked having someone scrub my back when I bathe. My mother did it for me when I was small. Later she hired a manservant, and he carried on the task." Elena froze, her cheeks flaring crimson. "Jonas," she cried softly, her voice unsteady. He chuckled low, but his eyes were not mocking. They shone with a strange sincerity. "And now, I wonder if you might do it for me." The room thickened. Elena wanted to turn, to refuse, but his blue eyes held hers, steady, earnest, as though this were no jest, but a plea to step closer. After a long stillness, she drew a deep breath and gave a small nod. The washroom filled with mist. Jonas sat before the wooden tub, his broad back bared, the shirt cast aside. His skin was bronzed, faint scars scattered across it from ranch work. Elena knelt behind him, cloth in hand, damp with warm water. For the first time, she felt herself this near to him. Her hand trembled as she pressed the cloth to his shoulder. Jonas closed his eyes, a quiet sigh slipping from him. "Just like I remember," he murmured. "Only different, because now it's my wife." Elena bit her lip, saying nothing. She moved the cloth slowly down his back, each stroke careful, deliberate. With each pass of the warm rag across his skin, her heartbeat quickened. Jonas tilted his head, surrendering to her care. Each sweep of her hand drew another deep, low breath from him, and the sound unsettled her further. Her hand was small, but in each motion lay an intimacy neither had ever known. "You know," Jonas whispered, his voice rough, "I've never felt this close to anyone." Elena's hand faltered. She wanted to deny it, to guard herself. Instead, she continued, the cloth tracing the muscles of his back, the heat in the room rising with their breaths. Water splashed lightly on the floorboards. Steam thickened. Jonas suddenly reached behind, catching her wrist, holding it firm against him. He turned, his eyes bright through the mist. "Elena," he said, low and ragged, yet clear enough she could not pretend otherwise. "I want you to bear my child," she gasped, lifting her gaze. Her dark eyes gleamed wet with steam. If you mean that, Jonas," her voice shook but held firm, "then I want it too." The space between them vanished. Jonas pulled her close, and the steam rose heavy, bearing witness to their joining. What began awkward gave way to fire, hesitant, yet burning, both tender and fierce. Elena lost herself in his arms, letting his hands guide her, letting her heart race to match his. The splash of water, the sharp breaths, all wove into a song they had longed for without daring to claim. That night, in the plain wooden washroom, they crossed the last barrier. No more vows of 2 years, no more contracts. Only truth, a man and a woman choosing one another, with heart, with body, with the desire to bind their lives together. When all had quieted, Elena rested her flushed cheek on Jonas's shoulder, her breath still uneven. He held her tight, whispering at her ear, "From now on, we won't need to pretend." Her eyes closed, and she nodded. In her chest she knew this moment had changed everything. In the first days of March, Red Willow lay damp and dark after a night of rain. The wind carried the scent of fresh grass, seeping through the cracks of the wooden house. Elena stood at the kitchen table, her hand resting lightly on her belly. She had counted the days, noted every sign, and this morning, when nausea seized her again, she knew for certain. No longer a lie told before her father. She was truly carrying a small life within her. Fear washed over her for a moment. Elena had never pictured herself as a mother. She, who had been raised like a display piece under her father's rigid hand. Could she care for a child? Could she be tender enough? Give it a childhood free of chains? Yet beneath the fear burned a quiet joy. She whispered to herself, "My child," and Jonas's. Jonas returned from the ranch as the sun bent west. His shirt clung with sweat, hair wind-tossed, but his eyes still shone bright. He stepped inside, ready to call her as always, then stopped when he saw her standing there, hand still on her stomach, her face a mix of confusion and radiance. "Elena, what is it?" His voice was wary. She turned, drew a deep breath, and whispered, "Jonas, I'm with child." The world seemed to hold its breath. Jonas blinked, uncomprehending. Then light flared in his eyes. He burst into laughter, pure, unguarded, shaking the house itself. He swept Elena up into his arms, lifted her high, spinning her through the room. "Good Lord, Elena," he shouted, his voice breaking with joy. "You've given me the greatest gift of all." She laughed, half dizzy, half embarrassed. "Jonas, put me down. I'm lightheaded." But he only held her tighter, grinning like a boy who had found treasure. At last he set her down, though his hand never left her waist, his eyes full of reverence. "A child," he murmured, almost to himself. "Our child." From that day, the little house stirred with life. Jonas could not keep still. He began to build a cradle with hands that had known only reins and axe handles. It was rough at first, but he sanded every edge smooth, painted it pale yellow until it gleamed under his touch. Elena set to sewing a quilt. Her needle, once used only to mend clothes, now stitched a fabric of warmth for their child. She sat on the porch, sewing and smiling to herself, imagining the baby wrapped in her handiwork. They began storing food. Jonas brought home sacks of flour, jars of honey. Elena lined them neatly in the kitchen corner. Each time they finished, their eyes met, and neither could hide their smile. In the evenings, when the fire crackled, Jonas would press his ear to her belly, pretending to listen. "Is it saying anything yet?" he asked, eyes alight. Elena laughed, pushing at his shoulder. "It's far too soon." "It's never too soon to hear your child's voice," Jonas replied, his gaze glowing so fiercely it warmed her through. To any who could peer through those timber walls, it would have seemed a sweet twist. The desperate lie she had once spoken now turned to truth. A falsehood had forced them to face each other, and the truth bound them in joy no one could sever. Often Elena sat in the kitchen, her hands on the small square of cloth, her thoughts wandering to the day her father would return. She knew Matteo would not yield easily, yet this time she felt no fear. Within her was a new strength, the strength of a mother, the strength of a wife who had chosen her place. Jonas, too, was changed. No longer drifting through days, no longer careless. Every act, every decision had purpose now, to guard the home, to shield his wife, to prepare for the child to come. One evening, sitting together on the porch, Jonas took her hand and squeezed. "Do you know, Elena, once I thought myself fit for nothing, but now, when I think of our child, I feel I can do anything." She leaned her head against his shoulder, smiling faintly. "So do I. This child makes me feel alive." Above them the stars glittered as though bearing witness to a new vow. And within the little wooden house, two once strangers had begun another story, not of lies, not of contracts, but of truth and of family. On the first night of summer, Red Willow lay wrapped in wind and the smell of wet grass. Inside the little wooden house, a dim oil lamp flickered over Elena's pale face. She braced herself, hands clenched white. Sweat streamed down her brow, her breath came ragged, yet her eyes held firm. Beside her, Jonas knelt, both hands gripping hers. Each time the pain surged, Elena moaned, and Jonas pressed his forehead to hers, whispering over and over, "I'm here. I won't leave. You're strong, Elena. You can do this." His hands trembled, but his voice stood steady as a wall. Old Doc Peterson bent low over the bed, muttering, "Just a little more now." "Hold on." Miss Marquez's wind rattled against the roof, mingling with Elena's cries. And then, after a moment that felt like a lifetime, a sharp, clear cry pierced the night. Jonas lifted his head, eyes brimming. The doctor laid the red, squirming child in his arms. Jonas fumbled like a ranch hand holding a colt for the first time. Then tears spilled freely. He broke into rough, unashamed sobs, the sound of a man stripped bare. "Lord, my son," he choked, his voice broken. Elena, drained and trembling, lifted herself enough to see. When Jonas placed the child in her arms, she gazed at him cradling them both, her eyes alight with joy she had never known. A weak, contented smile curved her lips. "Jonas, you see," she whispered, "our child is here." He bent to kiss her brow, tears still streaking his face. "You've given me everything." The following night, as their son slept in the wooden cradle Jonas had built, Elena sat by the hearth, an old marriage contract in her hands. Once those papers had been chains, binding them like strangers beneath one roof. Now they were relics. Quietly, she struck a match. Flames licked the pages, flared bright, then crumbled to ash, carried out through the cracks by the prairie wind. Jonas came to stand behind her, the baby in his arms. "You're sure?" he asked softly. Elena nodded, eyes on the drifting ash. "We don't need them anymore. From now on, no paper decides our lives. Only us." Jonas wrapped an arm around her, their child pressed between them, small but weighty as truth. He bent low, whispering in her ear, "Forever home." Elena closed her eyes, leaning into his chest. 3 heartbeats mingled there. Jonas's steady, the baby's fragile, her own fierce and alive. Outside, the prairie wind sang across the open land, a hymn without end. But inside the little house, time no longer mattered. They had found a home, forever, by their own choice. Morning sunlight spilled through the window, falling across the cradle Jonas had poured his winter's work into. The baby slept soundly, tiny hands stirring, lips twitching in dreams. Elena sat nearby, her face pale with exhaustion, but her eyes shining. Jonas leaned in the doorway, arms folded, gaze fixed on the two treasures of his life. He could not recall the last time peace filled him so wholly. Once he had drifted like a spoiled boy, always tended, never tested. But now, seeing Elena's faint smile and hearing his son's soft breath, he felt older, stronger, as if life had carved him into a man. "You all right?" Jonas asked, kneeling at her side. Elena nodded, taking his hand. Tired, but happy. He kissed her knuckles. In the morning light, they looked like two souls stepping into a new life. Past pain, only the backdrop that made the present glow brighter. That afternoon, wind swept the scent of wildflowers across the porch. Jonas carried their son outside, settling him in his arms to hear the rush of grass, the whisper of prairie air. The baby squinted, then suddenly burst into tears. Jonas fumbled, rocking awkwardly, laughter breaking through. "I'm clumsy," he admitted. Elena, watching from the doorway, teased gently. "Yes, but he's your son." Jonas looked up, his grin bright. "And I'll learn. I'll learn everything it takes to be a father." Elena joined him, shawl over her shoulders, and sat close. She touched the baby's tiny fingers, gripping Jonas's shirt. "He has your eyes." Jonas studied his son, then turned to her. "And that stubborn chin, that's yours." They both laughed, the sound easy, unguarded, the laughter of those who had found their place. That night, with the oil lamp dim in the kitchen, Elena reminded Jonas of the old marriage papers her father had once placed before them. Jonas fetched the yellowed sheets, set them in her hands. Without a word, she struck another match. Fire rose, casting her face in gold. She no longer looked like the girl bound by her father's rules, signing away freedom. She was a woman who had chosen, and who watched her chains turn to smoke. Jonas stood at her side, one arm around her shoulder, the baby cradled in the other. "You're certain?" he asked again. Elena's eyes shone. "Those papers once bound us. But now, we have another bond. Freedom, love, and this child." The ashes swirled out into the night, carried far across the prairie. Jonas drew his family close, his voice husky, firm. "Forever home." In the days that followed, life within the little house shifted. Jonas rose earlier, no longer letting Elena shoulder mornings alone. He carried the baby in his arms, pacing until sleep returned, before pulling on his coat for the ranch. Elena, though still weak, found her strength grow each time she watched Jonas working beneath the sun. The man she once thought careless now stood as her anchor, bearing weight and offering shelter. One morning, while Jonas split wood in the yard, Elena brought the baby to the porch. Tiny hands reached out, eyes following each sure swing of the axe. Elena smiled, whispering, "Look, my son, that is your father, the man who chose you and chose me, not by force, but by love." By autumn, the fields of red willow gleamed gold, and townsfolk whispered, "New." They saw Jonas and Elena walking to market, hand in hand, their son cradled close. The pity of old was gone. In its place grew respect and wonder. "They've changed," murmured the seamstress. "From a marriage of duty to a true family." Another nodded. Jonas heard, only squeezed Elena's hand tighter. She smiled, gazing at their son asleep against her chest. The voices outside no longer mattered. One winter night, when the wind howled across the grasslands, Elena woke to the baby's cry. She moved to rise, but Jonas was already there, lifting the child, soothing him with a clumsy song no one else would ever hear. Elena watched in the faint light, tears stinging her eyes. The man who had once been a stranger, who had once left her hopeless, now held their son with all the love and gentleness she had prayed for. When he returned to bed, laying the child between them, Jonas clasped her hand, whispering, "I'll never leave you alone again." Elena rested her head on his shoulder, tears spilling, yet her smile unshaken. Outside, the prairie wind hummed a blessing over 3 hearts beating in unison. No one counted days anymore. They had found, at last, their forever home. Across the grasslands of Red Willow, there once was a marriage that began with cold papers and vows that felt like chains. Jonas and Elena, 2 souls who seemed destined never to meet, wandered long through silence, distance, and nights that felt endless. Yet in time, through each breath, each clumsy glance, each small, unnoticed gesture, they discovered something simple and enduring: love growing from what once seemed barren. The man who had been coddled all his life, living in the shadow of others' care, became a husband and father willing to bear the weight, willing to steady his wife's hand through the hardest hours. The woman who had been bound by her father's iron will, taught to hide every feeling, finally found the freedom to weep, to laugh, to live true to her heart. A lie once spoken in desperation turned to sweetness when their child first cried into the world, and in that moment 3 hearts beat as one. The fire consumed their marriage contract, but not the memory of what it had cost them. Instead, it bore witness. Happiness does not come from contracts, nor from cold arrangements, but from daily choice, from patience, from the faith that love can rewrite fate. Beyond their walls, the prairie wind still sang its endless hymn. But within the little house, Jonas and Elena had found their forever home, a place where time no longer needed to be counted, where every moment was lived whole together. And perhaps this story leaves us, those who have walked a long road in life, with a gentle truth. It is never too late to find real love, never too late to learn kindness with one another, never wasted to believe your heart can still quicken for someone. If this story reminds you of a moment in your own life, of a partner who walked with you through storms, or of a beginning that seemed hopeless at first, please share it in the comments below. We would love to hear your stories, from those who have lived long enough to know happiness is built on patience and trust. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and share this video so that other hearts, especially those a little older, may be warmed by Wild West love stories like this one. And let us know where you're listening from, whether from the American plains, a quiet village in Vietnam, or a faraway corner of the world, so that the story of Red Willow continues through your voices too. Because in the end, we are all searching for a forever home, a place where love, memory, and tenderness dwell together.